we are dumping into the history of the band Massive Attack. Massive Attack is primarily three members: Grant Marshall, Robert Del Naja, and Andrew Voles, or as you probably know them, Daddy G, 3D, and Mushroom, respectively. They are all from Bristol, England. Grant Marshall is the elder statesman, born in 1959, and then 3D and Mushroom, both born in 1965. So let's hear a little bit about Bristol. We were joined this week by Melissa Chamam, author of Massive Attack Out of the Comfort Zone, and she gives us a little insight and background into Bristol and its origins.
Me that this was an interesting part of the story, right? When you're a band from New York, obviously there are so many people that came before you. You're not going to pretend you defined your city, right? But in that case, Bristol, when I went there with the idea of writing the book, a lot of friends told me, "Where is that? Are you not going to Brighton, or shouldn't you go to Liverpool?" Because they were already on a
Right.
global map of British music, right? So it became quite obvious that the music and the city were interlinked and they enrich each other, and there were a lot to tell about how it formed the bands. They didn't always agree with that though, especially Portishead. So if you know, Portishead is a little city outside of Bristol, so it has its name of its own. So not everybody knows that the band is named after another city. So sometimes the band doesn't like to be reminded that they have a link to Bristol, and they all want to tell that they have an exceptional trajectory. But in that case, I think for me, it was quite obvious that Bristol made that cultural moment quite special because of its long history. So Bristol is on a coast, on the west coast of England, southwest England, looking towards the United States and Canada. And actually, it started to become really wealthy when the trade with the colonies in North America really took, a flight, really went away. And Bristol had a very early role. The first ship that left Bristol for North America left in 1497. So that's
Oh,
only
wow.
years after the famous trip from Columbus himself. So there was a very strong route from England to America via Bristol. Actually, from London, that route was also later on reinforced by all the industrial era in England and the train ride. So for a long period, it made England very rich. And there was even a time where Bristol was richer than Liverpool or London, momentarily, I think half a century. But also, what made this sound particularly is what happened after that. So, of course, the main strong elements of the trade between the Americas and Europe was the transatlantic slave trade and sugar and plantations. So, I think Bristol had a stronger legacy than other cities in England with that culture, specifically the Caribbean culture, to jump back 3 centuries. So a lot of people from the Caribbean with African roots came to England via Bristol during the, let's say, the 1800s, the post anti-slavery era, and then of course with the Great Wars, especially World War One, and then after that was the Windrush generation, and that takes us to our time. The founders of Massive Attack and people like Tricky and other musicians and DJs who played with them when they were young were immigrants or children of immigrants from the Windrush generation. So what we call the Windrush generation is named after another ship that took labor workers from mostly Jamaica and other colonies to London to contribute to the reconstruction after World War II. So that was the culture they were all living in. They were listening to this music. They were going to bowls and parties where the parents and grandparents played lovers rock and reggae. And that was totally unknown in the 50s or 60s. It was just a personal experience. But I
Right.
think the first albums and the bands that predates Massive Attack in Bristol made that particularly strong as a root, because of course you know that this music is characterized by a mix of different genres, But those genres were kind of the heart and the soul of how it all started. And then, of course, came hip hop and a huge influence from New York, which is still linked to the history of Bristol, right? Because these generations kind of had cousins in New England or in New York or New Jersey, so they were very into the first records that came from the East Coast that were rap and black music. So that's the shortcut to why Bristol, I think, for me, just made their music very, very localized.
Yeah, it's a very unique melting pot, that. So yeah, culturally in Bristol, a lot of things going on there, and then by the time we're into the late '70s and '80s, Bristol's starting to develop its own kind of what they call a sound system culture, which is influenced by reggae, dub, soul, funk, punk, emerging hip hop. You have a lot of different music scenes coming on here. So we'll go back to Melissa to talk a little bit about that. Influences and the families that came there. With that and like the sound system culture, how did that help like shape the musical instincts of the members of Massive Attack?
Well, it helped that very, very directly because actually, you know what, most of the DJs in the band had family who were not only fans of music, but who had a direct role in how this music came to become alive in the city. Let me give you an example. Tricky, for instance, he grew up in South Bristol, and he had a very fractured family. He didn't grow up with his dad, but with his white family, his mixed race. But he discovered later that his father was one of the pioneer DJs in town, so that he kind of inherited his talent for picking sound. And Grant Marshall, who's known as Daddy G in Massive Attack, has the same story. His parents were crazy about music. They were always having parties at home, and they were spending their Friday nights in local clubs that would play Black American music and reggae particularly. So they grew up with it, and Daddy G became DJ at home almost. His first job, I think, was in a record shop. And so he and friends would pick up those records from Black music from all over the world, because obviously Black music is very, very post-Black Atlantic, right? It's very much
Yeah.
linked to the roots in Africa, to what was happening in the United States. And everyone would pick their side into this, the poor Jamaican reggae fans to the more soulful, complicated towards R&B sounds, and people who were pure rap, depending on sometimes their age gap. Mushroom, the third member of Massive Attack, he was only 15 when he started coming to the clubs, and he didn't start by coming to enjoy the music. At 15, he came to see the DJ and say, "You should play that," which is really,
Right.
really forward.
So yeah, in the early '80s, as this group is starting to meet each other, there's plenty of going on in Bristol as well. You have the St. Paul riots, uh, which we can probably compare to like the Black Lives Matter movement in America, or even some of the Rodney King stuff, where the city was protesting the racial injustices by police officers in the area, and ultimately it was a pretty successful movement. They were able to get the police to kind of change policy and back up a little bit, so to speak. But definitely, some political, tension in the area, and the guys in the band, as they're young men, are starting to take notice at this time as well. They all came together to form a group called the Wild Bunch, which is a Bristol-based DJ and sound system collective. Kind of just the group to hang out, throw parties, let's put on some tunes, let's have a good time, let's do some art, let's do a little bit of everything. Other members at the time included Nelly Hooper, who went on to produce a bunch of albums later on, and a young bloke by the name of Adrian Thaws, but you might know him as Tricky. So by the mid 80s, the Wild Bunch is starting to get a bit of a reputation around the city for genre fluid and, bass heavy parties that really are about the atmosphere over the performance. So let's hear a little bit about the Wild Bunch from Melissa. Just say something and express yourself. So I'm wondering, could you talk about how like record shops, clubs, and even some of the informal spaces like Revolver Records or the Dugout. How do those function as basically incubators for the scene?
Yeah, and you might know there is actually a book about the shop, Revolver, I think, by a British writer. So I wasn't there. Obviously, I'm much younger than the artists involved. But from what they were told, yes, it was very central because at the time, collecting vinyl was the typical hobby of these young people. And again, it's not true of the whole of Bristol, right? That sometimes people come to me and say, "I was there and I didn't do that." Well, obviously that
Not
yeah,
100%.
with
Yes.
people who invested in music. So yeah, you would buy a record and you would just exchange them with friends, and sometimes they would go to London to find the best records. So having um, proto DJ, someone with connections in Berlin and New York, like Mark Stewart, or later on Daddy D, in your own record shop in Clifton, which is 20 minutes walk away from your school anyway. That was a game changer because it became a daily activity instead of let's wait for that moment when we can go to London once or twice a year. And that was very central. And then from there, people would go a few streets down and there would be that place that called the Dugout, which was a club that again emerged from trying to put on parties in a disused bar,
Yeah.
becoming the place where you could see literally everyone, and the sound had already mixed then. The White Bunch were active first as DJs, so they would play tracks that were, hip hop from New York and then mix it with some post punk and then other soulful stuff. So while they were mixing, that's how they learned to maybe write songs in their own way because they were never musicians or they didn't start learning music in the studio. They really started at home with the first samplers and being obsessed with creating parties. And there was all this really interesting three pillars, like the music, the records, and then the parties, and then the visual side, right? So
Hmm.
the mostly, and that was very defining for 3D, the third member of my SITAC, the album covers. To him, it was like artwork. It was more important than painting.
Right.
It was like you collected them, you knew them by heart, you digged into what it meant, the history, the visuals. And that's how he started, doing flyers for the parties with different references to this record's, visual side, and then starting himself drawing, and he became a graffiti artist. So there was always this element of like how you dress, how you present yourself, and how you create that mystique around it. Like he would
Right.
represent young guys with that style, clashing punk and more of black music and reggae through graffiti. Like, it was only 20 years old. It was already a big star in Bristol because it was very much different before that era, like the early 80s. And that's a completely different thread in the book, right? Because it becomes a story of its own, where actually graffiti also arrived in Bristol way before other places in Europe.
Mhm.
So there were connections with New York, and 3D was really, really a key part of that. So from 93 and 94, he was already really known for making big murals, and all of them had reference to music. And his band, the White Bunch, but the White Bunch was not really a band, even though they produced a couple of EPs. They were collective, and they were more, like existing as DJ party enablers and what we would probably call today cultural curators.
Exactly. They're like professional listeners that are just trying to share their
Exactly.
joy, with the people that are there with them. Yeah, so that's a little bit about the Wild Bunch there, and we do want to go back to Melissa real quick and talk about the influence that the St. Paul riots, as well as the political nature of the times, had on Massive Attack. Or definitely a pretty pivotal moment in the city's history. How did that moment of like civil unrest and almost kind of even revolution shape like the political awareness of the artists of the scene?
Yeah, that's a very interesting moment, of course. There were a couple of series of riots, a bit more than that, but a couple of moments that were really, really strong, notably in 86 and in 81. And that was a time where basically, as I said, the Caribbean population, Caribbean British population grew, but the police repression in the UK at the time was really high. And they were very difficult moment in British history, not in Bristol, but in London, in Birmingham, and in other parts of the country, where repression was really violent and people died. There was also the New Cross fire, where a lot of people were killed that were supposed to be a race incident. So a big party, birthday party, I think for a 17-year-old, turned into a horror night, voluntarily started. And then there was a trial, and, no one got to be formally recognized as guilty. So that traumatized this part of the population, because let's remind listeners and readers that, these Caribbean people, when they came to the UK, they were under a heavy propaganda that this was their homeland. It was perfect. It was paved with gold, and that was where
Right.
they belonged. They would rebuild the country. They were needed. So they were not really prepared for the level of racism and exclusion. So a small community built up in St. Paul's, where people organized to resist and to protect each other from attacks and police brutality. And so the riots were a special moment where not only the Black people would march and face the police, but also other people joined. So this happened in other parts of the world, but I think for a city as small as Bristol at the time, it was probably 300,000 inhabitants, and for the UK, it was a pretty quiet, West
Right.
England is known for being quite green. It's the countryside, so it's one of the rare big cities there. And so it kind of stayed in people's minds. But I think what's even more interesting is how it was not really commented on and studied historically until very recently. And I also learned that, Bristol had its very Rosa Parks moment with the bus boycott that as well, similarly, was very, very rarely mentioned in history books, when actually a set of bus drivers of Caribbean origin went on strike because they were not allowed to work for the omnibus company. And so they kind of won. There was this big moment where people decided that, no, you are not supposed to do that. This is discriminatory. And the law changed in the UK. The first anti-racist law were actually written down and passed in Parliament, all that in the late 60s. So that was very the foundational, I think, moment that gave the people courage to protest. And it's also interesting when I talk to historians about that. Actually, the first guy who did his PhD about the riots was there himself at the time. So he was not only, going through archives, he remembered some of it.
Personal experience, yeah.
Yeah, and he could reconnect with the people who were directly involved. And he said to me, the fact that it's called riot is a way to politicize it, because we would call it uprising or protest, and riot is a way to say you are wrong, you are violent. And that's reproduced a lot in British history up until 2011 in London, and other moments that we would today compare to actually the Black Lives Matter movement, where they were protests against police brutality. They turned into riot because people, then came, join, and were angry and destroyed stores. And when you affect capitalism, of course, you make headlines as a rioter. But this
Exactly.
protest.
So as the 80s went on, the Wild Bunch, as young groups will do, started to dissolve organically. Nellie Hooper moved into the production side of things. Tricky actually begins pursuing some solo ideas at the time. 3D, Daddy G, and Mushroom, though, do continue working together. So in 1990, the trio actually adopted the name Massive Attack. They were at the time envisioning a studio-based collaborative project rather than a traditional band, incorporating other artists on different tracks just to kind of get a widespread of ideas and inputs. So at the time, let's see. Let's go to Melissa to talk about that ethos.
I think sometimes it was not always the most commercial decision, but I think it became important at a time where, if we fast forward a little, so Blue Lines came out in 91, and then Protection, Massive Attack's second album in '94. At the same time, Portishead released their first album, and Tricky went solo with his own. So there we have the Bristol scene. We're in the mid '90s, and the mid '90s are dominated in the UK by pop music and this very Britpop generation that is hyper commercialized, and it's typical reproduction of the Beatles' successful pattern: four boys, middle class, nice hair, and one lead singer that is quite sexy and handsome. This was
Almost
not
like you're describing Oasis or Stone Roses or any of those guys. Yeah.
yeah, and especially Blur.
Oh, yeah.
But that was not what the Beatles were. The Beatles were working class, and they all contributed to the song. But of course, the history, the mythification around the death of John Lennon, or whether you prefer Paul McCartney, that gave in the '90s that sort of band with guys who looks cool but are quite well educated, and so obviously Massive Attack, they were the opposite of that. They were difficult to get. They were many. They were working together. They always had many voices, and they kept inviting other voices into them.
Right.
So that's also a way to catch attention, and again, it's a way to be more faithful to who you are. It's still a statement about we started in those caves in Bristol. It was all for fun. Everyone was included, and that's the thing. It's not just black music, because today the UK is much more fragmented when it comes to this question. What happened at the time was so multicultural that it's hard to undo. That producer was a white guy, that the best rapper 3D was Anglo-Italian, and then you had people who were more African and Caribbean, and then Cherry, who was a friend of them, was Swedish American, Sierra Leonese. So
Right.
it was welcoming this openness and differences that today is a bit harder to do because of all the politics around identity. It's not so easy. Oh, if you want to be a black guy and you invite a white guy in your song, it's a statement. You can't just do it and just pretend that it's for fun. But that's what they were about. So that was also quite visually arresting, right? You had at the same time huge fame for people like Björk, who was still is from Iceland and moved to London. So the more different, the more space you could occupy. So I think it worked for them. And I'm sure the audience liked that because, you had some strong, successful patterns from the States with great, other gangs or.
So, as Melissa mentions, the first album that Massive Attack puts out, Blue Lines, it does come out April 8th, 1991. This album is a great blend of hip hop rhythms, soul vocals, dub bass, cinema orchestration. Has a bunch of collaborations on it, including Shara Nelson, Tricky, and then kind of I don't know, I guess you would say maybe legendary reggae singer by the name of Horace Andy. So this one does change a lot of things. It definitely, gives birth to the scene, the ugly two-word, seven-letter genre called trip hop that the band hates to be associated with. But fortunately for you, we can go into that much more in depth as this is an album that's on the Enemy Top 500 as well. So we'll talk about that a lot more in depth at a later time. 1992, Tricky departs Massive Attack to begin a solo career. Actually gains, some pretty good notoriety just by himself. 1994, September of that month, or of that year, sorry, release of Protection, produced with Nelly Hooper, who was one of the members of the Wild Bunch. So this album goes a little bit more towards like warm melodies, a little bit more jazz inflected. Still that ethos though of bringing in some guest musicians on it to contribute. And then, the mid 90s, we start kind of evolving a little bit. The internal tensions grow. 3D starts going a little bit more of the darker sounds, the abrasive stuff. But, Daddy G's wanting to do the groove and soul type stuff. And then that brings us to the recording of Mezzanine. So at this point, we will thank Melissa, and we will hear from her a little bit more later in the episode as we break down the album itself.